The theme is Serenity and Silence. And so at the outset, I'd like to call attention to the very potent quote for the week from Hermes, which reads, "A benign and intelligent silence is the precursor of effective beneficial action." Now, if you were about to go for a flight in a finely balanced and highly energized starship, such as the Aquarian Almanac, how would you approach it? How might one prepare for the mission? Other than a good familiarity with such a starship's instruments and controls and a practiced respect for its limits and possibilities, what kind of mental posture would you bring as you approach something that is so finely balanced and highly energized? The theme for this week, and therefore this year, gives us a clue: serenity and silence. Serenity and silence are the virtue and the vision with which to approach the Mahatmic current of the Aquarian Almanac, especially this year with its potent stream of Phohatic themes. Not only are serenity and silence a fitting approach to this year's almanac, but these two twin potencies are what is so desperately needed in our noisy world. You will notice that the theme title for this week is Serenity and Silence rather than Silence and Serenity. Why would this be? Would having serenity first suggest that everything unfolds from within outwardly? First, you have the state of mind. Then wouldn't the expression of that serenity follow in the form of silence? Would it further suggest that there is a place within that is already eternally serene, a calm and noetic current of remembrance to which one might return again and again? Then from there, would not one implement silence as a means and a method, suffusing everything that one would then do? Conversely, if one were not coming from a place of inner serenity, wouldn't one's apparent external silence be a rather mechanical contrivance? After all, we all know from experience that there is such thing as being externally silent. All the while, there could be a veritable cacophony of clattering and chattering going on in one's head. Yet clearly, there is some kind of a reciprocity between these two, serenity and silence. If serenity is a current of noetic remembrance in relation to the immortality of the soul, then silence would perhaps pertain to the metaphysical reality coming from the unfolding ontology of cosmogenesis. Is the AUM the affirmation of our immortality, while OM is that of eternity? Yet it seems that there can be a dialectical movement and mobility between the two. Could there not? One is not necessarily above the other, serenity or silence, so it wouldn't be a vertical mobility, but instead a movement of within without, and then of without within, as if one were superimposed over the other, with that which is behind coming through the one in front, and then alternately it could be the other way around. In other words, serenity could come through one's silence. Even a very moving and powerful serenity could come through, even in an apparent bedlam. And this serenity could radiate through the tapas of one's self-imposed silence. What if there was a bustling intersection, say in a large Indian city, with, say, a hectic roundabout with cars and buses, three-wheeled tuk-tuks, motorcycles, and bicycles, many of which are beeping and weaving. And there's a dog lying down under a tree, just noticing it all. Or there's a bullock serenely chewing its cud. It seems that the animals here in India completely know what's going on. And the children do too. But going back to the serenity of the bullock, isn't there that phrase quoted by Crosby, "They also serve who stand and wait"? I forgot who said that, but Crosby quotes it. The bullock is a still point in the seeming chaos. The bullock here has something to offer, something which connects with the supreme point, with the serene point in the still and moving center that is in each human being. Such is the potency of serenity radiating through one's silence. It makes you wonder about the many people who come to lodge meetings who don't say much, but you can feel their serenity. It makes a difference. There's a quote from William Shakespeare in the Aquarian Almanac for Saturday. It says, "Silence is the perfectest herald of joy. I were but a little happy if I could say how much." Alternatively, just as serenity can radiate quietly, yet joyously and effectively through one's silence, so it also seems that the silence itself can speak to one's inner nature via the logoic voice of the silence, provided that the soul's serenity allows it to unite with the silent speaker. The quote in the almanac from the Voice of the Silence for January 1st says, "Before the soul can comprehend and may remember, she must unto the silent speaker be united, just as the form to which the clay is modeled is first united with the potter's mind." In the same vein, the Mahatma K.H. once wrote that it is upon the serene and placid surface of the unruffled mind that the visions gathered from the invisible find a representation in the visible world. Otherwise, you would vainly seek those visions, those flashes of sudden light, which have already helped to solve so many of the minor problems, and which alone can bring the truth before the eye of the soul. And this is his instruction. He says, "It is with jealous care that we have to guard our mind plane from all the adverse influences which daily arise in our passage through earth life." This passage suggests that if we really wish to become the better able to help and teach others, as it encourages us to do in the ULT Declaration, then we can think of even our own minds as the gift that it is. Manas is a gift, right? That our minds are like a resource that we possess as a trustee for the sake of others, for the sake of all that lives. It is in this light the KH is imploring that the student actively cultivate serenity of mind by guarding the mind plane from all the adverse influences which daily arise in our passage through earth life. While it is true that one need not strain oneself in trying to be serene, still, we have to protect the mind from adverse influences. One of the sayings of the Buddha is, "The wise value vigilance as their chief treasure." It is in the dead of night, Damodar K. Mavalankar writes, "In the dead of that is, when there is complete physical and mental rest, when there is perfect quiet and peace of mind, it is only then that the individuality of man, his higher nature, becomes a fit vehicle for the manifestation of the word. If the student is encouraged to cultivate serenity of mind, B.P. Wadia is helpful when it comes to suggesting some ideas about cultivating silence. But he also brings to light important points pertaining to the absolute necessity of silence in the student's life. He writes, "Our modern theosophical student has not fully recognized the occult significance of silence." This is in his article, The Vow of Silence. A vow of silence, he writes, does not mean to become mute and not to speak at all. And then he itemizes these 7 aspects that have to do with silence. That what the vow of silence is in a 7-fold manner. Number 1, he says that it's the self-imposition of periodic silence. I think that Gandhi would take a day off once a week from engaging in speech. Different people would do self-induced and self-devised efforts along these lines. The self-imposition of periodic silence. The second one is not indulging at any time in injurious or untruthful speech. This is a habit that must be checked. And if one makes a mistake, it's no big deal. You make corrections and you move on. But not indulging at any time in injurious and untruthful speech. This is part of the vow of silence. Interesting. Not giving away to useless speech. Every word is chosen. Not asking questions. Here's an interesting one. Not asking questions on philosophy or practice till what has already been taught or is before us is fully scanned and thoroughly looked into from the point of view of our particular questions. So deliberation, even with asking questions. It's interesting that we say that there's no such thing as a dumb question. And there isn't. But what if a person really was honest with themselves and read assignments before they came to meetings, thought through questions, read the assignments more than once, kind of culled out and distilled out, what are the real questions? Number 5, not indulging in ahankaric speech, that is, not making statements about the divine self or ego in terms of our kamic or lower nature. Interesting. That's how he defines ahankaric speech. To me, that would be saying things about the reincarnating ego, but projecting the shadow of the personality onto something that doesn't really know that much about, which is the sacred mission of the reincarnating ego. One time, it could be also asked in this light about ahankaric speech. Do we notice how often we refer to I when we talk to others? I did this, I said that. Number 6, not indulging in injurious speech regarding our lower nature, our own faults and weaknesses, lest by speaking of them, we lend them the strength that ensues from the power of speech. So there's kind of a false humility, apparently, in putting oneself down or dwelling on that, because that gives, one's faults a strength that otherwise they wouldn't have been given just from the power of speech. The 7 and the last one, not to speak even of that is true, but don't even speak the truth, unless at proper times, to proper people, and under proper circumstances. Very interesting. It's the idea that words matter. Every word is a living messenger, and they should be released at the right time, at the right place, for the right reason. And all of this has to do with the vow of silence. So all of this has to do with the use of speech, but it's really under an article called the vow of silence. And somehow this parallels to me this idea of this incredible year in the Aquarian Almanac, and the continuity, the through line, is serenity and silence. Then he says, while the sevenfold exercise is practiced, secrecy has to be observed about it. A person wouldn't call attention to oneself. Oh, I'm doing number 5 today. I'm not indulging in ahankaric speech. Really? Okay. So he's saying that deliberate speech will be the result of these implementations of this vow of silence. And then he says it will not be rooted in kama, passion, but in buddhi, compassion. And this student would add that such speech will not only be deliberate, but it will also be joyous, because it is rooted in the joyous silence of contentment, devotion, and gratitude. And it is true that intimate, meaningful, beneficent speech infused with loving kindness is, like silence, all too scarce. It is in serenity and silence that the healing takes place within the inner vestures, from which can be expressed the healing speech that we sound out in the world. The serenity engendered by a positive reverence for silence, not just the absence of speech, forms a deep well from which creative healing speech can be drawn. Each word uttered becomes a healing messenger of hope and grace. We thus consecrate the organ of speech as a sacred instrument to dispense the regenerative therapeutics of a higher logos. Are you muted?
Are you? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. It's an interesting analogy that the almanac is a starship as a vehicle of which we could travel through a year learning about serenity and silence. And also how you could be so calm and serene. But Judy has a comment.
Yes, Jonathan, I want to thank you for speaking from Chennai, because it must be about 4:30 in the morning when you started in the middle of the night and very dark there this time of year. But I also wanted to mention that I'm glad that you quoted the last line of the Miltonic sonnet on his blindness. They also serve who only stand and wait. And I memorized this poem as a teenager. Of course, Milton is the second greatest poet in the English language, and it has indeed an an internal tension in it of a man who has lost his eyesight in midlife and now wonders how he can serve God. He's a Puritan, he's very devout. And then he realizes that, although there were those who speed in post or land an ocean without rest, is one of the lines in the poem, to serve God, they also serve who only stand and wait. So sometimes the person who is silently at his or her post just does their duty is the person who is most needed, who is most called on. And I know this has a great deal to do with serenity and silence. I remember my husband telling us a war story once when a ship came in that was all shot up in the New York Naval Shipyard. And he asked the captain, were there heroes that brought this? And he said, well, everybody just did their job and we got the ship back to port. Oh, they were badly crippled. And that seems to be so important, the point you made about standing and waiting. I mean, you might be the third or fourth string quarterback, but your number might be called and you may be leading the team. Well, this has happened recently. So I just wanted to thank you and comment on that.
Thank you, Judy. They also, I think I misquoted. I said they also serve who stand and wait, but the real quote says they also serve who only stand and wait.
I believe that is the case. I memorized the whole poem a long time ago, but Milton wanted so much to serve, being that he was a Puritan, but then he realizes that he can go on blind, and he dictated Paradise Lost to his daughter, blind. Of course, I don't know if the poor daughter liked it that much, but the rest of the world did. So Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, and of course, both of them.
It seems like it's a waiting that is not a passive kind of waiting. It's like you're on the deck on a ship paying attention, waiting for the fog to clear, but you're not passive about it.
Right. If you're on watch, you're not passive.
Yes.
There's it's like an intelligent serenity, apparently is like an intelligent silence somehow. It's like it's informed, it's not vacant. It's I was thinking of the yin yang symbol. You have the dark and the light, so you have the active and the passive, but within the active is that kind of little dot that's the passive, and within the passive you have that dot that's the active. So the passive is like the silence, you could say, but really it's an awake silence. There's something within that silence that is not only poised for action, really, but useful in many, many ways.
If you look at like the Voice of the Silence, for instance, or other literature, silence is associated with the higher self, with the seventh principle. Now, that's silence. So serenity, do you think that has primarily to do with the mind? Like you said, it's upon the serene and placid surface of the unruffled mind. So do you think that serenity has to do more with mind and silence with silent watcher or seventh principle?
I think that that Michelle has the answer, or Jim does.
Do you have an answer, Michelle?
I do not. I have a question.
Go ahead. What's your question?
Well, I was wondering, Jonathan, if you could speak about serenity in relation to the Sutratman and yes,
That's the question. Speak about the serenity in relation to the Sutratman.
and continuity of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We could think about continuity of consciousness in the micro. Theosophy talks about the three planes of human life, right? The sleeping, the waking, the waking, the dreaming, and the deep sleep. But then there's this kind of mystery principle of Turiya. But whatever it is, there's such thing as continuity of consciousness because it's the same person that goes through all those states. So then, how do we cultivate continuity of consciousness? They say that thinking about universal ideas and trying to make them a matter of practical application in our daily lives, that creates a linkage through to our higher selves. And so that in turn makes it so that Sushupti can have relatively more of an effect on our daily lives. And the cultivation of consciousness not only is kind of a metapsychological reality, but it's something that can be cultivated. And likewise with, I think, serenity and silence, that there is a metaphysics to the silence, and that the serenity has to do with the immortality of the soul. That these are facts in nature, but these are also things that can be cultivated. Like, for example, without continuity of consciousness, what is there left? Fragmented consciousness. Is fragmented consciousness really, how could that be really something that would be serene, right? And without serenity, how could a person really know the silence? If a person is agitated or rajasic, for example, if you think of the three gunas, it would be the deliberate cultivation of a sattvic continuity, it would seem. That there would be, and if a person did it in the service of helping others, and did it for the sake of not for oneself, but for all of humanity and future humanity, then it seems that a person would be doing something. But I don't know if did you have any other dimensions of that question that you wanted to explore?
No, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Shilpa?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Jonathan, and welcome to Chennai. I was I was struck by the thing about joy. I just couldn't help thinking about Rigoletto. I think it's a opera by Verdi where the heroine talks about Joya in the end of her aria, talking about her love uh, for somebody. And I thought that word joy is such a beautiful concept of love. And so when we talk about this is a different kind of a love. And so the serenity goes with this love, harmony, and equilibrium. So would you like to comment about that when you talked about joy?
Here's another thing here. This quote from Shakespeare where he says, "Silence is the perfectest herald of joy." So you can never say perfectest except for when you're quoting Shakespeare, right? Silence is the perfectest herald of joy.
Yeah.
I were but little happy if I could say how much. Yeah, the joy of silence, the the harmony of silence, right?
Mhm.
The freedom of
Mhm.
silence. And and you were just now saying the love. Did you say that again about
Yeah,
how you?
yeah, love, yeah, love. Because I always think of that beautiful aria from Rigoletto, where she
Mhm.
ends it with the words of joy in that aria, expressing her love. So, I mean, she's talking about love for somebody. But here I think I'm looking more in terms of universal, which is a totally different dimension.
You know, Shobha, you're from India, and it's like, well, let's put it this way. I had a conversation with a young Tamil on the airplane, and he was like a Bostonian yuppie, but high-powered kind of guy that probably makes six figures and whatever.
Mm.
But I played with his mind a little bit, and I says, there's a joke about India. I says, really, what's the joke? He says that India is the proof that there must be a God, because the place is so dysfunctional, and the bureaucracies and the roads and everything, right? Nothing really
Yep.
works, but
Mhm.
somehow it all works. It all works.
Yep.
And he got pretty cosmic right away. He
Yep.
he actually said, it's really a unity in chaos, and I don't know, but to me, Chennai and India and so forth is the perfect place from which to be thinking about serenity and silence. Um, just the children, just the love in their eyes, um, and just the sounds that you hear, so forth. I think you know what I'm talking about, Shobha.
Mhm.
Mm.
Thank you,
Laura?
Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you, Shobha.
Well, it was interesting when you mentioned fragmented consciousness.
Okay.
And when we think of what the description of India, it seems like behind the fragmentation that is so much visible to the senses, there is an underlying unity that Shobha mentioned, that there is somehow or other it all works. And we think that when looking at the voice of the silence, and we think of silence and serenity, that part that mentions where there is the flame that is beyond the wind and the forces, that flickers not, that is undisturbed. And so when we try to look for serenity outwardly, we cannot find it. It's fragmented. It comes in pieces. But it's only when we begin to recognize that flame within us that we begin to see the underlying unity. It's not a question, but it's a thought that came to mind as listening to Shobha and Jonathan speaking of serenity there and India.
Well, there's kind of a logoic transmission that takes place if we find the silence within. It's like you find the voice of the silence, you could say. And I was thinking about India, and others could correct me if I'm wrong, but it just seems like the country is so old that there is transmission of wisdom, of philosophy. I mean, granted, India is an up and coming country. I mean, it is an economic powerhouse, and it's the largest democracy in the world, and it is taking off. That's what it just seems like. Granted, all that's true, but what's also true behind the scenes, within the scenes, is this incredible transmission of traditions, of religions, philosophies, sciences, arts, literatures, diversity of religions and so forth, diversity of everything, diversity of philosophies, right? And diversity of culture, the diversity of different kinds of people, different traditions, diversity of the handcrafts, diversity of music, diversity of dance. And all this is being transmitted down through like a current through the years, through the centuries, through the millenniums. And speaking of the love that's involved, think of that kind of traditional teacher-student relationship that's going on, where people take on a younger person. And probably even now, there's a little bit of frustration because the young people want to zip around in all with different directions. But there are some who do take on the self-discipline of learning from an elder, and they learn a musical instrument, or how to make a musical instrument, or how to make a statue like these like a Shiva Nataraj or whatever. So there's to me that's the continuity of consciousness through time, you could say, in terms of a transmission from one generation to another, where there's the love and the respect going in both ways. But and it just seems to be that there's kind of a current, maybe a continuity of consciousness, that is like a current that just goes through the middle of it all. And because maybe in the old days they would call that a personal God, but it has to do with a current that's generated by humanity.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. It does seem like any lasting serenity would have to come from within, as you were talking about, Jonathan. Otherwise, you're constantly disturbed by external circumstances. And actually, the Sthitta Prajna, the self-governed sage, steadfast wisdom, that's one of the marks, right? Is that it's undisturbed in any circumstance.
Yeah, it wouldn't be very becoming of a yogin to say you're bothering my meditation or something, or to be too much worried about externals. It doesn't seem like,
Oh gosh, when you say that, Jonathan, it makes me think that you couldn't say, like Arjuna asking in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, how does the sage sit? How does he walk? You couldn't actually say anything about what they may or may not do, because he will do whatever is appropriate to the circumstance.
Right.
Or
Is there
she.
any other people who haven't jumped in there yet?
It seems like on a theme like Serenity and Silence, you could be silent for a long time.
Jonathan, is there such a thing as a dumb question?
That's so pregnant with possibilities. If I was going to be quick at the draw, so to speak. But what do you mean by that? I don't think I can hear you. Yeah.
I just asked him questions.
Yeah. I don't think there's such a thing as a dumb question, but I think what Wadia is trying to talk about. See, I just thought that the whole thing was interesting, that the article was the vow of silence. And then the whole article, he's talking about speech, really. And he's talking about what silence is and what it isn't. It just seems that a person who is kind of steeped in the kind of silence that Wadia is talking about first of all, that they would take a break from incessant speech. And they would think things through, and they would realize the potency of words. And they would think things through before they say things. And I mean, to be honest, this is something I've been working on all my life, thinking things through before I say things. So I'm not trying to act like I'm coming from this big elevated place or something like that. I'm just saying what BP Wadia was teaching. That thing that he says about questions, when you think about a lot of the times when people do ask questions in meetings, it seems that perhaps that they're not really thinking through the consequences of the question, or if they spend a little bit more time thinking about the question, right, then they could pull off what Michelle just pulled off. What is the relationship between silence and continuity of consciousness, right? And then a person could go really deep with that. Mm-hmm. I have found myself in meetings kind of going around in circles, trying to figure out my question, doing figure eights, and the person is finally wondering what they're going to do with my question, right? So I'm not sure that I was asking a dumb question, but couldn't I have done it more noetically? And I think that's kind of part of possibly the working with the practicing of theosophy and working with that article that HPB introduced at the end of her life, what's psychic and noetic action, where the word action is like doing anything. So in other words, everything can be done noetically or psychically, no matter what. And if you think that through, I wonder if I could drive noetically. Probably could. Or what am I driving psychically? In other words, if a person is acting, truly acting monasically, and with the light of Buddhi informing it, then a person is acting noetically. So therefore, within that, it would seem that there are probably very noetic ways of asking questions.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Michelle?
It's actually Jim.
If it is Jim, we're not hearing him.
Oh, why don't we, 1 second, sorry.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Perfect.
no, we can.
Oh, now you can hear me? Yeah, your voice sounds better. Okay. No, what I had said was, what Jonathan, what you just said about questions, speaking with referencing BP Wadia, but was very interesting and helpful. And it suddenly brought to mind when I was studying a little bit classical Indian education, and then I went and studied Pythagoras, the Pythagorean community. They both shared in common many things, but one of which was the student initially is involved in raising questions. In fact, in the Pythagorean school, you weren't allowed to raise or speak in the presence of an elder in the community. Now, one of the reasons why it was explained is because to the unfolding mind, it's more important to stress listening than it is speaking, the ear rather than the tongue. And what happens is when students are listening to teachers, they do have questions that arise in their minds naturally. And there is a desire to ask the question, but they're not allowed to ask the question. And that is an interesting principle because what happens is they then become, after getting over a little frustration, they then pay much closer attention to other students who are allowed to ask questions. And they're so grateful when someone asks a question that's been burning in their mind. And they then also learn more because now they're listening more attentively to other students who are allowed to ask questions. They listen more carefully to what the teacher is saying, because in many respects, the teacher will answer the question. So there is so many multiple benefits that come from that. Plus, they learn to refine the questions that they have, to simplify them. And then at some point, they're told one of the reasons why you're not allowed to raise a question is because most questions are ego-centered. And you haven't gotten to the point yet where you can raise a genuine question. Now that you've been through your probationary period, you're now allowed to begin raising questions. And even though you'll be imperfect, you'll learn how vital questions are to actually bringing an answer from within.
Robert, can I jump in on that for a minute?
Of course.
Okay. I was thinking while Jim was talking of the importance of asking questions, and it's the supreme prerogative of manas, really. And how if a person can cultivate the art of asking questions by not being allowed to ask questions, maybe for a period of time, or however it is, different lifetimes, different epochs, different things, perhaps. But whatever it is, think of how important that is in terms of the monadic pilgrimage of the awakening, of becoming an Atma Buddhi manasic entity, of just how important that is. And so in other words, the learning how to ask questions is an incredible opportunity for the soul. I mean, think of how many thousands of lifetimes we go through. But if a person could really start to ask questions, and if a person begins to ask real questions, do you think it is the first time for that reincarnating ego that they ever asked that question before? And what an incredible opportunity to tap into the continuity of consciousness. And then there's this idea of the Shravaka, but then there's the idea of the Shramana, who is the actor, as I think, is somebody who does, it goes beyond asking the question, but it goes to taking action. But the thing is then a person is doing something even more monastic, which is the taking of vows. So the first thing in the monastic awakening, it would seem to be the honing in on the asking of questions. I mean, I've seen sometimes when people will ask a question in a meeting, it's like hitting the mark right in the middle of the bullseye. What a question. Not that I'm being judgmental about other people's questions, but it's just, you can feel it. But it just seems that kind of what this theme is of serenity and silence has something to do with manas and the true essence of what manas is, which is very interesting because of January 4th and the symbolism of the birthday of the Dhyanis and so forth, and the awakening of manas. It's just, I mean, I'd never really thought about that even.
Donna, you have a question or comment?
It's just a comment, but I think since I put my hand up, it's kind of been covered, but I remember numerous times in the lodge in Santa Barbara being reminded that to ask a question meant that it should be something that was relevant to everyone, something that everyone could benefit from, which made you really think about your questions. So in terms of whether or not there's ever a bad question, maybe it's not so much it's a bad question, but it's just really not a question unless you've put it into the context of benefiting the whole, something like that anyhow.
Yeah, thanks for reminding it. That is helpful to me to understanding what is not an ego-centered question.
Hmm.
That's a good way to get beyond that. Diane?
Yes, this subject reminds me of the Gita, that passage, I think it's the 4th chapter, where it talks about the the 4 things you need to search for knowledge. And that is, questions should always accompany humility and strong search and doing of service, it seems. They all kind of go together, and they help and amplify each other, it seems.
That's very,
You have a response, Jonathan?
it's well, and it's what Donna was saying. They're both saying the same thing, and I really like the amplifying part of it. And then it says that the wise will make. What does it say? It says, "Seek this wisdom by doing X, Y, and Z." Right.
Right.
Then there's and then the wise
Service.
will, yeah, and service. And then it says that the wise will communicate it unto thee.
Yeah. Right.
Why does it say the wise who see the truth will
Hmm.
communicate it unto thee? I mean, it must be see with the inner eye,
Hmm.
not see with the physical eye. The idea of vidya is to know. That's something that I have been confused about in the past, is that passage in the Gita you're referring to.
Yeah. The
Yes,
wise who see the truth.
will communicate it unto thee, knowing which thou shalt never again fall into error. Yeah, that passage. Beautiful.
One thing small that I could possibly contribute, this is not the big answer, this is just me playing around the edges, is the wise who see the truth, but they also see the truth in relation to the questioner. So Krishna helps anyone who comes towards Krishna in the way that they do it, right? So the wise who see the truth, they're not only seeing the truth, but they're seeing the questioner, and they're seeing that they're seeing the quest that the questioner is on, and they probably are aware of quite a bit about the questioner, and about kind of where they're coming from and so forth. And then they can, and HPB was really a master of that. She demonstrates that ability in the key to theosophy, where she meets every questioner right where they're coming from, it seems.
The way Bhavani Shankar interprets that passage in the Bhagavad Gita is that what it really implies is a total faith that there are those who know, and that one has the capacity to learn. So the strong search and the questions and humility are all based on this underlying faith that this perfected beings do exist and have the capacity to pass on their wisdom. An interesting way of looking at it.
That's what's the case in the Friendly Philosopher, in those 6 virtues that Crosby treats of. And then the one called Shraddha, the way he describes it, is the student's implicit faith in the teacher's power to teach, and somehow concurrently in their own power to learn. It's interesting that Shraddha kind of encompasses both. It kind of has faith in the teaching and learning process, I guess.
Yeah. And one could imagine that the the firmest one understands the lodge of Mahatma, the more the serenity. And it is hard to, we look at our chaotic world and all the things that are going on, and to think that there is a true Sangha of enlightened beings that overbroods the entire evolution of humanity, that's ever accessible to the attuned consciousness. It's just puts a whole different light on life. But Laura, you raised your hand several times. You don't have it raised right now.
Well, everyone's been covering covering the subject so well that I could lower my hand. But one thing comes to mind in this, and questions and answers, and how helpful it is when a student who has a better understanding reframes our question and helps us by reframing it. Yeah. And sees where our struggle is, understanding the struggle of forming a question and helping the student to reframe it. And the other thing that comes to mind, it's no matter what great teacher down through the ages, it seems that the work is of questions and answers and promulgation is always left to the students. To those who don't know. Here we are sharing theosophy when we barely understand it ourselves, and there must be a reason for that. There must be something important in that. What is important in that effort of students?
Yeah, no, there's a good question. So what is important to students pass on theosophy, even though their understanding is limited? Jonathan?
Well, I've got I'm at Adyar here, and I've got this theory about Adyar that the Theosophical Society has it's an amazing thing. You can feel the vibration, the Mahatmic vibration. To be honest, that's what I think. So at Adyar, but there's a lot of funny stuff on the surface. Let's just say that. But they kind of operate on what I call the great man theory. Okay, that there's no exact teachers. You all find your own road. You do this. You're Krishnamurti this. You're Annie Besant that. Some people are into HPB. Different people are into different things. I think that the tradition of the ULT is a little different in that they really go in with the idea that there's cycles, that real teachers really do come, and that there's a rhythm, and that there's sometimes that cycles that the teachers work with large groups of people, and sometimes they don't. But they're always working. That's what Crosby says. Never doubt it. The masters always stand behind. They're always working. The lodge never ceases to exist. It's just that they send messengers in different times, and they don't send the messengers at all times, because then you'd have a dogmatism. You have to almost withdraw, pull back, and let people work on their own. But then another messenger comes. It's sort of like that. But there's this kind of breathing that goes on, and that's kind of the continuity, I guess, of consciousness. But this reminds me of something else. Many times we think of human evolution, and it's self-induced and self-devised efforts, and we don't really think it through that much, maybe, that okay, we're going to get more and more perfect, I suppose, and then be a master someday, or an adept. But there's kind of an intermediate phase that's called chelaship, and it would seem that chelaship, the beginning germinal roots of it, would be something that would develop over many, many lifetimes, and that a person may not even know that they're under the guidance of a great being. But whatever it is, they have to do the willpower of self-induced and self-devised efforts. I mean, even Judge was kind of left on his own for years, right? And then he kind of mysterious things happened and he took off in his ability to get traction and work. And he demonstrated that. And, you know, he was from some points of view, he was a chela. At other points of view, he was in a very advanced depths. And these are all mysteries. And maybe it's for our own protection that we don't even really think about these things too much. But there's the idea of learning to be of service. If you wish to serve us, serve our humanity. And if you wish to know us, study our philosophy.
Yeah, that's the mantra. There is the interesting teaching of Jesus that wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I also. So if one has genuinely taken that inner posture, when you're talking about theosophy, and you know, we talk about HPV, but HPV was the Mahatma herself. She was on par with. So that's what you talk about here, Jonathan, when you're talking about paradoxes. You have this vesture that she used with all its limitations, but it served the purposes of the lives. But she herself, as a Mahatma, was just a small manifestation of that being. But that was all that what could be done at the time. So it strikes one that in passing on theosophy, one gradually learns about the inner posture, which a lot of it has to do with the theme for the year, Serenity and Silence, because of that supreme mystery of the inner life. How's your comment? Oh, well, we are at the end of our time. All I'm going to say is that next week the theme is civilization, death, and regeneration. But did you have some final comments, Jonathan?
No, just thanks everybody for coming. It's a very deep subject, and thanks for everybody's questions. So I'll go ahead and because since the meeting started with the bhajans, I'm going to end it with one too. So and people can stay or not. Well.
Hey Gobind, hey Gopal, hey Gobind, hey Gopal, hey Dayal Lal. Hey Gobind, hey Gopal. Gopal, अनाथ सखे प्राणनाथ अनाथ सखे प्राणनाथ अनाथ सखे दीन दर्द निवार हे गोविंद हे गोपाल हे गोविंद हे गोपाल हे दयाल हे गोविंद हे गोपाल हे गोविंद हे गोपाल हे दयाल हे समरथ अगम पूरन 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 मोह माया धार हे गोविंद हे गोपाल हे गोविंद हे गोपाल हे दयाल हे गोविंद हे गोपाल हे गोविंद हे गोपाल हे दयाल अंधकूप महाभयान अंधकूप महाभयान अंधकूप महाभयान अंधकूप महाभयान अंधकूप महाभयान नानक पार उतार हे गोविंद हे गोपाल हे गोविंद हे गोपाल हे दयाल हे गोविंद हे गोपाल हे गोविंद हे गोपाल हे दयाल
Well, thank you all for coming. Have a good year. Happy New Year, by the way.
Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for being here.